Okay, this is going to be quite an awkward recording. So I just want to make a small addendum on when I was talking about the Holy Ghost and it having a particular relationship to a subjective impression of the water or something like that. In some sense, I think that the water can be seen as a kind of objective metaphor, that the subjective framework is um, obviously the subconscious being the subjective framework is going to have some kind of reception or relation to the unconscious conception of itself within some kind of objective paradigm, and in some sense that is generally very close to conceptually so the water being the fourth dimension of psychological reality, what ought be has is in some sense a contextual model of what moderation is. Uh, it gives you a general suggestion as to what to. It's very closely related to the gut feeling of things, as it were. But in some sense, in terms of the Holy Ghost having any relationship to the water, I think that it is more going to be how sort of faith constructs are going to be seen operating within the water. So in some sense, it's even quite abstract to the water itself, that it's not going to be particular, kind of wheels within wheels. It's more like a kind of a respect for a basic philosophical distinction and structure. In some sense, it's more important about its limitation, about the status of forbidden knowledge in some sense. Because if you deconstruct the water into a kind of extroverted intuition reductionism of the kind of the Holy Ghost, of the kind of dimension 11 of psychological reality, you end up in with an ambiguous concept of self, which sort of discombobulates your capacity to actually discern or to think through things with beliefs in any kind of subjective, coherent framework. So you end up sort of creating a speculative, hypothetical, contemplative paradigm that an image of yourself operates in, but the base image of that self doesn't even hold any cogent identity because it's untethered from the subconscious. It exists only as a figment in the unconscious. And then your subconscious is enslaved by that figment, which I take to be essentially what happens when you actually make the Holy Ghost into an effigy, into an idolatry of some kind, or you create a narrative that subverts your self-determinism and that hands you essentially an identity which then your subconscious becomes a slave to. And so then you don't actually have an authentic subconscious. You don't have an authentic Keegan stage 2. I mean, this is probably the biggest critique that I have about people that, at least I've taken this from secondary sources, people that have told me about what the Keegan stage model sort of thing is, and that essentially, to me, it seems that I understand that, there's this famous sort of trope of that people who are in Keegan stage 2 think that they're in Keegan stage 4, but they're not, or they think they're in Keegan stage 5, but they're not, because they have a kind of false reading of things, and, sort of there's a kind of meta-fluidity in some sense, which, again, from a secondary source that was related to me, that Keegan seems to describe, that in my view, is actually closer to what is already generally conceived of as Keegan stage 3.5, which is a kind of nihilism, except that this meta-fluidity plays a game with this nihilism because it basically turns it into a sociological toy interface That sort of a lot, as long as you can kind of take along a sociological, you can take furnishings from the sociological realm that you can sort of supplement for your lack of a stable Keegan stage 2. And so essentially they are, in my view, in some sense, this is just another sort of way of constructing a kind of juvenile Tower of Babel out of Keegan stage 3.5, essentially out of the unconscious. So I do think that essentially the unconscious is the hardest sort of developmental obstacle to graduate from. And there are sort of many different ways in which one can depend on other Keegan stages or impinge on other Keegan stages or create paradoxes between other Keegan stages, which in some sense justify the bad integration between the subconscious and the unconscious. That these are all just basically of that genus. They are all developmental obstacles of that genus. And in some sense, I think that that integration is only possible once the ego, Keegan stage 4, can integrate with the superego, which in my view is Keegan stage 1. So when Keegan stage 4 integrates with Keegan stage 1, then I think that essentially that is the synthesis of that is something like Keegan stage 5. But that, in some sense, is only possible once you've graduated properly from Keegan stage 3 with some kind of tentative integration between the subconscious and the unconscious. And I think that that tentative step into the ego, when the ego is stepped into, it's never with any kind of solidity or confidence. And the kind of metafluidity which is often spoken about, in some sense, I think, is not properly aware of its own precarious psychological need, or in that it's not properly aware of all the dangers, as it were, because even how I've stated it is the paradoxical trap, that essentially if you can constrain yourself within a sympathy-grabbing narrative, then you can afford yourself a kind of rationalistic tool to build a Tower of Babel in Keegan stage 3, which then you sort of are standing on to elevate you out of Keegan stage 3, and this is just essentially untenable. And so my view is the only way to properly graduate from Keegan stage 3 and into stage 4 is essentially some tentative grasp of epistemic agency, that you know all the hazards, but you don't know the correct answer. You have a catalogue of wrong answers, and you are sort of always within the realm of this quite humbling realm of this kind of not capable of trying to build constructs out of salt water, essentially, out of which is, so the salt being dimension 6 and the water being dimension 4, and when dimension 4 sort of preempts dimension 6, which is also in some sense metaphysically what you can see happens in the world in general, is that people inherit their habits from the dead. There is salt as residue in the water left over from the dead, from those who have not executed their will, and therefore their promiscuity is inherited in the water, is inherited in the culture, in the nations of the world, in the seas of the world. The white knights, the spirit of the irresponsible father, as it were. That somehow the systemic scapegoat is going to pick up the tab for their kind of naive narrative and their rationalization Tower of Babel. So it's an immaturity problem, which this is the perennial problem of the human condition. This is why we need the rule of law and we need accountability, because essentially, if the only measure or the only check within a society is a democratic check, then essentially there isn't enough mirror, there isn't enough of a reflection of essentially or a proper substantive bounding of against against let's say, accountability paradoxes, or a kind of negative feedback spiral vortex of escalating and so it's one thing, it's one thing to meet someone who's maybe only in Keegan stage 2 and they want to have right beliefs, and in some sense that impetus is certainly more pure and more correct than someone who knows in some sense that there aren't right beliefs, but you just are trying to pick the winners that afford you the convenience of your Keegan stage 3 Tower of Babel. And so you've kind of got this one hand washing the other hand, and that kind of integral bad faith is something that is, I think, akin to borderline personality disorder. And it's quite interesting because now we're seeing this on a macro sociological scale. This is why it has so much sort of proto-fascism around it as well. But anyway, okay, so this is not what I wanted to talk about, although I could have done a better job at going through that more slowly and things like that, and getting into more, so it's more easily observable within structures. But I wanted to make, and this is something that I've brought this up in many times, and I must caution the listener that perhaps I'm committing a kind of anthropomorphized projection, and I have to give that sort of caveat because I can only see it from my perspective, as it were. And I'm a Metatype 13. Metatype 13s, in my view, I think, are special. That there's something about Metatype 13 that I think it cultivates blood covenants. That's all I can sort of, it's just, and I think that it might have to do with, and this might be slightly, that it is connected with something to do with the apostle, and it is connected, I mean, I've speculated that Moses was a Metatype 13. Now, the reason why I make all these connections, which, almost sounds like a bit of self-aggrandizement there, or at least that could be honestly speculated against me, but what makes it special? What makes it special is that the superego child function is dimension 4, which means that the whole thing rests on the water. The whole thing rests on idealizing the water, and Metatype 13s, I think, and I've been thinking about this in my own life, because are prone to a kind of quixotic, and I mean I've explored this with my bipolar discussion, or my explanation of the content of bipolar, or at least of, and I sort of was using anecdotally my own sort of upbringing, just in terms of the particular Metatype 13 that I have, that has a double circuit within it, and I was now it's again, I mean, you see, the reason why also I think that, well, again, I'm still putting down caveats. I've often thought that maybe Metatype 13 was the personality style that was precipitated in the fall of man, that Adam was a Metatype 13, I believe. And the reason why I think that this Metatype 13, or at least maybe the metagram of my Metatype 13, is particularly special, and it's capable of this quixotic self-delusion in terms of the water, is that might be a necessary precondition to falling into sin. that in some sense I think that the first spiritual gift, the gift of the apostle, is necessary because it is the foundational gift, because it is at the root of of the thing that conceived the fall in the first place. So it's this weird bridge between karma and the transcendental in some almost a priori kind of categorical, philosophical, metaphysical sense. I'm just using those as adjectives essentially. But and the reason why I'm elevating this Metatype 13 to be so special or whatever is because, and this is complicated, because the fall, I think, might also on some level be a necessary evil, if I could put it like that. Not to tread on the toes of the Holy Ghost, but essentially that because what consciousness is, in terms of, in reference to God, means that we do actually have to have a free will, and in some sense we can't evidence this free will, we can't express it or manifest it, unless we actually choose to overcome the world, as it were. And in some sense, the mark of having an understanding is sacrifice. The mark of anything is sacrifice. There is no evidence, there is no proof, there is no will, in some sense, without a willing sacrifice. And, serving the will of God, you have to know the will of God. Are you willing to sacrifice even to know, even to understand, to know that you understand? This is a hard question. This is something like the question that the philosopher's stone amounts into answering, essentially, if it is to be the true philosopher's stone, as it were, the foundation, the cornerstone of philosophy of truth, the gold, the transmutation of base metals into gold, into the golden truth. Anyway, so what is the gift of the apostle? Relative to the other personality styles. And, I was thinking about this because I was just thinking about the sociological practical challenge. And this, comes to my perhaps misuse of the word quixotic in my earlier recordings. Perhaps slight misuse, that idealistic and impractical. If there was one word that sort of encapsulated the fight between the spirit and the flesh, I could imagine quixotic might fit that bill. And I do think that all Metatype 13s have this crux that they are attending to, that they are attentively following the thread of how to solve for the quixotic. Although I used it in the context that I have a double circuit, but there are other themes of the other, or there are basic structural themes in the Metatype 13 itself, which perhaps also reinforces this in terms of that the whole thing is predicated in water. The only positive dimension in the whole false ego circuit, I believe, is the child function of the superego. And then the unconscious dominant function is the 13th dimension, is faith. And the 7th dimension is the identity or the death, the conditioning, the foundation of the subconscious. The 7th dimension being the blood. So I think that this might be also, what I've just mentioned might be the best way to summarize the character of a particular personality style. Is that you look at the child function of the superego, you look at the dominant function of the unconscious, and you look at the foundation of the subconscious. And there's a kind of, well, that's a kind of overview, summarized formula of the personality. Okay, so if you do that, well, I know that the child function of the superego and the dominant function of the unconscious, those are very thematically central. You notice that essentially I haven't mentioned anything about the ego in that. I mentioned the unconscious, the subconscious, and the superego, and I haven't mentioned the ego, and that's essentially because your ego is the thing that is the medium in which that these other things are being managed. So sort of the ego is the is the picture viewer. Uh, so it can attend to all these different, it can be an audience to all these different prime objects, and it can sort of be a switchboard of how these things are ultimately integrated or not integrated, in terms of how they are prismatically impacting on the various elements within the within the dominant function, the child function, the parent function, and the inferior function. And usually people will just generally have a very bad relationship to their ego's inferior function, and the kind of the adversarial nature that they have to their ego's inferior function is going to be the thing that to some degree allows you some latitude of being able to enter into a fixed or regular pattern of how the ego is attending to one or more of the, or having strategies, stable strategies of attending to or contending with these prime objects of the superego's child function, the unconscious dominant function, and the subconscious identity or foundation. Now, I wonder if I've chosen those things in a special kind of order in some sense, maybe. I mean, there are other things that could be picked out, but I do think that it's a nice compact way of seeing the overview of it. I mean, obviously, perhaps it's slanted towards my particular idea of working towards the proper integration between these sides of the mind, and their proper sort of growth and development, as it were. Now, the reason why I'm going back to the Metatype 13 and saying, now I'm speculating about so many things, because I must say I have been thinking about how the proper integration of the metatype perhaps leads you into an ultitype in which you are no longer in a metatype anymore. You actually graduate into being able to effectively use all the dimensions of psychological reality in a fairly robust sort of way, and then each dimension will reach its proper functional optimization, and that there is a kind of there is a natural kind of motion, if I could, a style of motion or a way of operating it, which essentially, is a kind of transcendental personality that somewhat emerges, that can sort of optimize its capacity for doing intellectual work, etc., or something like that, or spiritual discerning, and and all sort of general capabilities are open for such a type to be able to develop, or such a transcending of type is capable of performing. But what can I say? What can I say? What is my point? My point is that that, let's say, the healing process or the integration process might need different metatypes, and this is slightly speculative. Different metatypes might need different assistance in performing the integration. And essentially, this all has to be done internally, but and this is a sketchy kind of way of speculating about this, but essentially, that other spiritual gifts might themselves be quite representative of an integrated, holistic ulti-type, and those properties might, in their different proportion and in their different propensity of people's capacity to exude them, or channel them in some sense, even within a metatype themselves, within a false ego complex, that essentially that they can really help other people in a kind of education of self self abuse, as into the removal of self abuse, but that essentially I'm making perhaps the claim that you might be able to increase on some metric of towards attaining towards some kind of utilitarianism, but without the gift of the apostle, perhaps essentially that the door is barred, the door is closed. That you might be able to sort of peer through the window, but essentially there is a model of the water and I think that this is how people end up sharing the same water that is pure, is that they can only do it by being fed the gifts of the Spirit of the heavenly dimensions. And So essentially, in the unity of the faith, and being edified and receiving edification from sort of the evangelist, and all these sort of much more esoteric metaphysical kinds of gifts, that gives oneself the model of entering into a shared spiritual reality and a shared water, in that sense, that is within the context of a particular communion. Um, and although you wouldn't share this with a denomination, but you would share the capacity to perhaps enter into it within particular contexts, that essentially that you are in the vicinity, you share the same water. But because this ability has been essentially cultivated, and that I think is only sort of the precondition of that is something like the gift of the apostle, but it's also could be seen in another way, that some metatypes perhaps need certain things modeled to them in terms of the activity or the behavior. And that the gift of the apostle is somewhat the ability to provide that role model. Be something of a scaffolding for the capacity of having shared water. I want to say some more things, but I don't know if I should. But essentially, the gift of the apostle, the reason why it is inhabited within dimension, within the Metatype 13, or is exemplified by Metatype 13, is essentially because the foundation of the subconscious for Metatype 13 is the blood. And so, in some sense, they are something like the psychological tenant of, when I say tenant, I mean as in like the thing that supports a structure, a fundamental tenant, as in a fundamental constituent piece of the puzzle, that through their blood as an antennae, it is already predisposed to being imprinted on according to the value that their water has idealistically contended. I could describe it in slightly pejorative terms just to get the just to get the understanding of the structure across, but essentially it could be seen as a kind of water magic, if I could bastardize it like that. But essentially, but you see the magic of a pure water that has no eminence in it, that has no dimension 6 in it, um, that has no salt in it. And then essentially I should have probably said this before I set all of the stuff up, but probably the most toxic element of any metatype is that when essentially the parent function of the superego is covering for, let's call it, the vulnerability or the susceptibility of the child function. Because as soon as the parent function of the superego is awakened to some activity, it's a direct bad faith within the positive sides of the mind. When I say positive, I mean within the metaphor that the superego is like a negative and the other three sides of the mind are a positive development of that negative image. So the negative image is controlling the projection when light is shone through it, because of its filter and its blocking, and then it's creating a positive image through its filtering of the system. And so you want the filtration, or you can't avoid the filtration of the superego according to its child function, but you do want to avoid the filtration according to the parent function, because then essentially that is the influence of the knowledge of good and evil. Essentially, the parent function is going to operate against the other sides of the mind as essentially a kind of knowledge of good and evil, which is going to obscure solving the fundamental riddle of the mystery of the superego's child function. And it is essentially the obfuscation of solving that mystery, or at least of confronting it, that essentially is the deferment of the integration of the entire thing and actually is working out what's going on inside of you. Although, I mean, I don't know this for certain, but essentially it seems that people doing this within, it seems the way of the world at least is that children grow up first, and then they develop these structures, and then they have to kind of go back and excavate against their bad faith, or to try to grow up after they've really sort of metastasized, juvenile, perhaps even borderline type structures of a kind of structural dishonesty and bad faith between the sides of the mind, sort of Keegan stage 3.5 kind of stuff, which is, stuff which you can see happening in a sandpit when you're 4 years old, 5 years old. It's that kind of maybe that's slightly unfair. No, it's not actually that unfair. Because essentially, look, in little children, you are going to see them use their superego parent function quite heavily, I would even say as well. But usually, it's not even nascent, it's naive. It's purely innocent, because they don't have an unconscious correlated structure. And in some sense, you can use the parent function. In some sense, that's what probably provides the oceanic, dreamlike state that young children have in consciousness, is because they have free reign and free access to using their superego parent function. It's not bogged down in essentially a kind of paradoxical feedback yet. It hasn't, there aren't enough structures in the other sides of the mind, in the positive image, has not been developed well enough from the superego to run into performative contradictions, and a kind of fundamental disintegration, or a non-integration between the three sides of the mind. And that's interesting as well, because the Metatype 13, in some sense, right at the coalface of it, is confronted with this internal challenge of disambiguating, or at least of to develop nicely and well, is to keep the salt out of the water, as it were, and to allow the water to continue to be, because I do think that essentially you can integrate something like the child function into, well, you don't even have to, it's going to be present, it's going to loom over the entire structure. I mean, this is what is described as the Whore of Babylon, as mystery itself. It is the mystery that is the ambiance of the entire false ego complex. What should I do? And so, you only want to sort of naively be using the parent function of the superego, because if you're contending in it in a kind of in a dominating way, in a way that's in league with the dominant function, then you are essentially setting yourself up into a contradiction that you. Sorry, I'm making a strange kind of metaphor here, but essentially I'm saying that a lot of the general metaphysical problems that people are repeating the drama thereof is essentially because they have something like the thing that rules the entire structure is the superego's child function. Then essentially, in the ordinary worldly person, you have the parent function of the superego is then next in the pecking order, and in some sense it inherits a lot of its power from the child function, because it's working as a regent of it, as a representative. Um, and then as a regent, it is creating a paradox, because it is both relying on but also speaking for the dominant function, even though the dominant function precedes it in terms of actual prerequisite epistemological uh, validity or something like that. And so the parent function is almost by definition, in being above the dominant function in terms of this pecking order, is going to exceed its scope that the dominant function would otherwise allow for it. And so the dominant function is being permissive of a parent function, supposedly on behalf of the child function. And that essentially is the knot, is the congealed, sort of mass that sustains, the that is the negative imprint of the positive developed non-integration. That these two are reflections of the same thing. Um, and in some sense, but the ego is still different from all of this stuff, because although the super ego was right there when this was all happening at the beginning, the ego gets so knotted up that it really actually, and the ego is holding the driving seat and the driving steering wheel to anything and everything. So you do actually have to fix the ego's problems first, even though, let's say, ontologically, they're not prime. They're secondary, but they are necessary secondary developments that have to be attended to um, first. Okay, so what this all means, what does this all mean, is that I wonder if there is any particular relationship that I could make between these three things. Is that, I mean, the child function is probably the most closely, the child function of the superego is most closely related to the ego itself. The dominant function, I think, is most closely related to the subconscious. And the parent function, sorry, all of these things. So the dominant function of the superego is most closely related to the subconscious, and the parent function of the superego is most closely related, I would say, to the unconscious. And that is actually so that is the negative microcosm that, when positively developed, sort of is the blueprint of the recurring drama that the three other sides of the mind are embroiled amongst each other within, and therefore we have, the kind of the developmental challenges that I've outlined many times. Now, anyway, in talking about all of this, I'm really elevating the status of this Metatype 13. And perhaps I'm incorrectly doing so, but I do think that water, especially in that, when you understand that if my doctrinal theology is correct, which I believe that it is, that essentially that if the challenge after the fall is to achieve Christ consciousness and the understanding of the will of God, and apophatic understanding that can be shared and that can be fostered to actually cultivate a you know that the way that how these things play themselves out in the various different dimensions, it is, in some sense, in my mind, fundamentally true that the water also being one of the witnesses of the Trinity, and when combined with the topic of belief or the mind, and with the concept of discerning, or I guess the water and the spirit both together. That's another thing, is that the spirit dimension 2 of psychological reality, in a metatype 13, is the ego's inferior function. So in some sense, the apex of the responsibility that the metatype 13 is capable of contending within their ego is all housed within the spirit. I should really use this rubric and start looking at the other metatypes and seeing if I can't make much more stable archetypes within a typology, because that would also make my model of personality. I mean, people love typologies, you know. People make new typologies that are very descriptive and that seem workable, or at least can be used to in some kind of application. You know, people go crazy for that, and that seemingly has a theory that has some explanatory power. Um, could be a way also to teach spirituality or spiritual teaching in a much more personalized way, in some sense. You could actually have books that are tailored to uh, people's classification of their typology, essentially. But anyway, I was just saying that basically Metatype 2 is so what was I saying? I was saying that Dimension 2 is just interesting because it features prominently in the Metatype 13 as well, but and in some sense, I mean, I've always regarded the inferior function of the ego as being the only source of free consciousness, in the sense that it is the only source of free will. It is the only lever. In Scientology, this is called the tone arm, and I think it is essentially the seat of, if I could call it, free theta. It's called, which means uninterpolated theta. Theta being thought, or the capacity to process and to theta is kind of associated with spirit and with mind. Um, Man, I'm doing bad remembering definitions. Anyway, so if discerning itself is Metatype 13's free theta, then sort of it has every opportunity, or every perhaps resource, to explore the space of the quixotic conundrum that the superego's child function represents, and as it casts a shadow against the ego, for the inferior function to sort of be tried by. And so, sort of you have free theta to either perform that trial or to perform the technology of the crucifixion, which is essentially to be silent against your accuser, be silent against dimension 4, and be crucified for the sins of the world. When you're silent against dimension 4, when it makes essentially aspersions or accusations, then the inferior function takes on responsibility for the entire structure, and you actually have the potential of integration in that essentially the inferior function will be reborn as the dominant function in the superego, and you will have a basic and perhaps that is also the because that's an interesting, because there's a positive to negative. That's the ego connecting with the superego, but at the same time, in a representative fashion, it is the ego connecting with the subconscious properly, because it's integrating in a way that it's happening through the superego. And therefore the superego's dominant function is no longer being split. It's no longer having fractures in it. It's no longer having fundamental fault lines and divisions, and it's not getting cracked up. The Gita, there's a description of the many-branched intelligence as being essentially one of the marks of the fallen karmic, the covering of the living entity. Or the covering of the soul with its enemy, material energy, which is a pictorial way of also expounding on the many-branched intelligence. You can kind of see the difference between positive and negative in that juxtaposition that I've just tried to fetch from the Gita. But anyway, and then the parent function being very connected with the unconscious side of the mind is then sort of, when the pecking order is different, when essentially the dominant function has precedence and predominance over the parent function, then the parent function essentially is no longer instigating that sort of fundamental inherent conflagration within, sort of turning the dominant function against itself. And essentially when the dominant function is no longer against itself, I argue that essentially it recovers the blood of the saints from Babylon the Great, and it constitutes the New Jerusalem, essentially. And perhaps the parent function ends up being manifested in a way that it never was manifested before, in a way that mends the fracture, or at least the historical behavioral fracture of the branched dominant function of the superego. Okay, so I remember saying this cynically a long time ago, that essentially all I'm doing is I'm modeling, making a general. I'm primarily testing my own personality type, while at the same time creating a generic model that models everybody else simultaneously, and making it robust enough that it does capture everybody else. That was my whole project, essentially, in developing my own false ego complex, which I took to be a self-concerted effort on my part. I remember having a grievance when I was born, and holding that grievance in abeyance until the age of 3, and then holding it in abeyance again until the age of 7 or so. Or no, or 6, I think. I remember that I was in junior school. It was like my first year of junior school, maybe second year. Maybe it was the first year. I remember where I was. I don't remember which grade I was in, but I remember exactly where I was in the school when this issue that was held in abeyance then returned to me a second time after I had sent it away the first time again, because I was busy dealing with things. I was contending with a lot of things simultaneously, but and then I worked out that essentially I would make this part of my plan then, because in some sense sending this issue away was a way of me, even before I knew exactly what I was going to do with this, the reason why I held it in abeyance was because I wanted to understand the temptation, so that I could understand other people that had given into it. And so I would mull over it and consider it. And then I held it in, and I would sort of test bench the emulation of that way of thinking, that it would perhaps lend me into being inducted into its program. So I was trying to get a reading of what that program exactly is, and essentially makes me sound sort of ultra logical. I remember thinking many times that I couldn't put down this one complaint that I had, but that having the complaint led to implications that were essentially, it was a fundamental paradox within the water. So in some sense I probably was, and I mean I have to think about this more perhaps, because I mean so I've said that I didn't have a metagram type until the age of 7, but I think I must have had a metatype. I must have been a naive metatype 13. I think I must have had a metatype that I was even in the grips of. So I've got some irregularity there that I need to clean up in terms of my theory, or at least going back and updating. I haven't updated my labeling of these sorts of things, and what was happening to me. Perhaps I should concentrate. Often that's my problem, is that I'm trying to generalize my model so much and think about broad things that I don't sort out my own problems psychologically in such a way as to provide a more luminary light as to how to understand the generic problem, because I'm not doing enough work on myself, as it were, perhaps. But that if I was actually more self-interested, it would actually be much more productive in this topic, at least. But I've always been at great pains not to accelerate too quickly through any kind of self-healing, because then documenting it and modeling it perhaps becomes jeopardized. Anyway, again, this could be another quandary, you see. So when I fell into my own false ego complex, it has created this beautiful rabbit hole of a sort of Mobius strip. It's almost like a water water game that one is being incept, is kind of like a water inception that is kind of like, two mirrors facing one another. And then you can see an infinite regress, or, obviously not actually infinite, but it appears to be a way to create an infinite amount of hypothetical introspection and further self-diversion into deeper and deepening the re-establishment of itself. And in some sense, this is all what the water fundamentally is that it doesn't work unless it's happening in conjunction with the spirit. The water itself is never going to, it's always going to be something of a generalization. You're not going to find any stable solution in it. It's just a kind of medium, another medium that the truth can be resident within, but it's and it does lend itself to its particular. Maybe I should think about that carefully and try to delineate the particular use of it in contradistinction to the other witnesses. I did that a while ago, in fact. I'll think on that again. Anyway, let me stop this recording. I'm starting to ramble.